Hello, my friend. Welcome to the long quiet. Tonight you are the head librarian of a small, Sleepy Hollow library, closing up on a snowy December evening in 1898. By a little before 8 o'clock, the snow had been falling for most of the afternoon, and Eliza was beginning to think about closing up the library. The library was called the Sleepy Hollow Public Library, and it had been called the Sleepy Hollow Public Library for 31 years, since the spring of 1867, when the town had voted to convert the front of the old Beekman house at the corner of Beekman Avenue and the lower end of North Broadway into a reading room for the use of the citizens of the village and the surrounding townships of the Tarrytown Valley. Eliza had not been the first librarian. She had been the third. She had taken the position in 1876, at the age of 33, after the second librarian, Mrs. Ackerman, had gone south to live with a daughter in Trenton. Eliza had been the head librarian for 22 years now. The library had not, in those 22 years, asked her to be anything else. She was 55 years old. She was a small woman, not tall, with a fine straight back that she had kept by the long habit of standing on small step stools to reach the upper shelves. And she wore, in December, a dark gray wool dress over a white high-collared blouse, and a small dark cameo at the throat, and over the dress a thick navy cardigan that she had knitted herself 2 winters ago. The cardigan was warm. It still held its shape. The town in which the library stood was the small Hudson Valley town of Sleepy Hollow, just at the north end of Tarrytown, where the Pocantico River ran out of the low wooded hill and bent down through the meadows toward the great wide Hudson beyond. The town had perhaps 2,000 people in it, and Eliza knew most of them by sight, and a smaller number by name, and a smaller number still as friends. She had become, in 22 years, the bookish woman of the town, and this was, for her, a satisfactory thing to have become. The library had 4 rooms. The front room was where the reading table sat. 4 long oak tables with green-shaded lamps along their length, and the racks of newspapers from New York and Albany that came up on the morning train. Behind the front room was the larger middle room, which held most of the general collection. The long oak stacks running floor to ceiling in two parallel rows, with a narrow aisle between. Behind the middle room was the small reference room, where the old county histories and the bound periodicals and the small set of older volumes were kept in glassed cases along the walls, with a single deep armchair beside the iron stove and a green-shaded brass library lamp on a small cherry desk, where Eliza did the daily writing of her work. Off the reference room there was a small back office, with a counter and a sink, and a small kerosene plate for the heating of water. Upstairs, accessed by a narrow door at the back of the office, was Eliza's apartment. She had lived there for the full 22 years. The snow had been a long, quiet snow. It had begun around 11 that morning as a slow thickening of the gray air over the Hudson, and had become, by 2 in the afternoon, an honest, steady December snow, the kind that comes down in even soft curtains and asks nothing of anyone. The streets outside the library window had gone slow in the way streets do in steady snow. The few buggies that passed went slow. The few people on the sidewalks walked slow under their long, dark coats. And the figures viewed from inside the library through the snow-blurred glass were small, dark, moving shapes, going one way and another, in no particular hurry. The gaslights along Beekman Avenue had been lit since 4, and the lights had become, as the dark deepened, the small, steady anchors of the village, each one a small yellow circle in the falling snow. Eliza stood for a moment at the window and watched. She had a cup of tea in her hand. She had been drinking tea in her small, careful way since about 4. The cup was a thick, white china cup with a small chip in the rim that she had chipped herself in 1883 on the corner of the counter. The chip had become familiar. She drank. The library had been quiet for most of the afternoon. A young woman had come in around 2 to find a book of carols for the Sunday school program at the Reformed Church. And Eliza had spent the better part of half an hour with her, walking the music section, pulling down volumes for her to consider. She had settled at last on a small cloth-bound copy of Bramley and Stainer's Christmas Carols New and Old, and she had thanked Eliza with that small particular warmth. that people use when they have been helped without being hurried. And she had gone out into the snow with the book in a brown paper wrapper pressed under her coat. After that, only a few patrons. A boy of perhaps 11 had come in at 4 to do his arithmetic at the long oak table by the window, and Eliza had brought him without being asked a small slate and a piece of chalk, and the boy had nodded at her and bent his head over his sums for an hour. A woman of about her own age, a Mrs. Vanderveer from the white farmhouse out by the bend in the Pocantico, had come in at 5:30 to return a novel and to take a Mrs. Humphrey Ward in its place. Then, for an hour, no one. She had used the time. She had sat at the small cherry desk in the reference room and worked through a small pile of letters from the dealers in New York and Boston. She had drunk her tea. The bell above the front door rang once. She turned from the window. A man had come in, stamping the snow off his boots on the entry mat and shaking his hat against the door frame. And the man was Mr. Theodore Pell, who came into the library every Friday evening to return whatever he had taken out the Friday before. Mr. Pell was the master of the small district school out at Beekman Hollow, a man of about 45, quiet, kind, with the small, attentive eyes of a man who had read a great deal and would read a great deal more. He had been coming to the library since '83, 15 years now, and he had become what Eliza thought of as one of the small handful of true friends she had made through her work, although they had never in all that time met outside the library. "Miss Crowe," he said. "Mr. Pell." He hung his hat on the hook by the door. He stamped his boots once more on the mat. He came forward into the front room, holding a book wrapped in a small square of wax paper to keep the snow off its cloth. "You said you might have the second volume," he said. "It came in on Wednesday." Already? Already. She walked behind the long oak counter and pulled from the small stack of held items she kept on the shelf below a volume wrapped in brown paper with his name written on it in pencil. She set it on the counter. He picked it up, unfolded the paper a small distance to see the cover, smiled and folded the paper back over the book. He set the volume he had brought to return beside it. Eliza took the return, opened the front board, set the card in the small wooden tray to be filed in the morning. She took the new volume, drew out its card, dipped her pen in the inkwell on the counter, and wrote the date beside his name in the small, steady hand she had been writing in for 22 years. She slid the book across the counter to him. 3 weeks, she said. I'll have it back in 2. You always do. They did not speak more as he tucked the book inside his coat. There was no need to speak. It was a transaction they had done together perhaps 300 times. Snow's coming down, he said. It's a fine snow. I think it'll be down all night. I think so. He paused at the door, his hand on the latch. Miss Crowe, my sister is coming up from the city for Christmas. She's a great reader. And I told her she should come and see the library. She's welcome. I told her about your bound Harper. Eliza smiled a very small smile in the way she smiled at the long stretch of all the conversations she had had about books over the years. She should come. Good night, Miss Crowe. Good night, Mr. Pell. The bell rang as the door closed behind him. Eliza stood at the counter for a moment after he was gone. The library was, again, very quiet. The snow against the front window was a small, soft sound. The sound of snow against glass, which was almost no sound at all. Only a kind of pressing of the air. The clock on the wall above the counter, an old wooden wall clock that had hung there since before her, ticked its slow, steady tick. Somewhere in the middle room, a board settled with a small, soft pop, the way old buildings do when the temperature shifts. She drank the last of her tea. She set the cup on the counter. She looked for a moment at the long rows of stacks stretching back through the rooms of the library. The stacks were oak, dark with 20 years of lamp soot, and a finer dark with the long, quiet touching of hands. And they had been built by a carpenter named Schenk in 1868. Eliza had inherited them. The bones of the library were Schenk's bones, and Eliza, looking at them, thought, as she sometimes did, that she was the temporary occupant of rooms that had been set in their shape long before her and would remain long after. She walked to the front door. She turned the small wooden sign that hung in the window from open to closed. She slid the bolt across the lower part of the door. She drew down the small green blind on the door's window, which she did not always draw, but which she sometimes drew on snowy nights when she did not want any passing patron to look in and see the small lit room and feel encouraged to knock. The library was now hers. She stood in the front room for a long moment and let the small fact of having closed up settle around her. There was a kind of small daily ceremony in this. The library became, between 8 and 9 in the evening, a different building than it was during the day. In the daytime, it was a public place. After 8, it was something else. It was her rooms. It was where she lived her evening. She went then slowly to the long row of wall sconces along the front room wall, and she began the slow, small turning down of the gaslights. The library had 9 gaslight sconces in all. There were 4 in the front room, 3 in the middle room, and 2 in the reference room. They had been put in 14 years ago, replacing the old kerosene lamps that the library had used in its first decade. The gas was cleaner. The gas was steadier. She had grown fond of the small, soft hiss the gas made in the lines. A hiss so faint that one only heard it in the deepest quiet of the building. And she heard it now. She went to the first sconce. The sconce was a small brass fixture set into the wall at the height of her shoulder, with a frosted glass globe and a small brass key beneath it. She turned the key. The flame inside the globe lowered, slowly in the way that gas flames lower, from its tall, steady evening flame down to a small blue point. And then she turned the key one further. Small turn, and the flame, with a small, soft pop, went out. The front room sank a little into its smaller light. There were 3 sconces still burning, and the long green-shaded lamps on the reading tables were still on, and the room was not dark, but it was a little less bright, and the air of the room changed in the way that a room's air changes when one source of light has been taken from it. She moved to the second sconce. She turned the key. The flame lowered. She turned it again. The flame went out. She moved to the third. She moved to the fourth. By the time she had turned out the 4 front room sconces, the front room was lit only by the lamps on the reading table, which she would in a moment walk back and turn off one by one. But she did the wall sconces first. She always did the wall sconces first. It was the order in which she had been taught the closing by Mrs. Ackerman. On a snowy December evening much like this one, the order had not changed. It would not change. She moved into the middle room. The middle room was longer and narrower than the front room, and the 3 sconces along its inner wall lit the long stacks in a soft, low light that made the spines of the books, in their cloth and leather bindings of every color, glow faintly from within their long rows. She had always loved this light. She had always loved the long oak shelves and the way the books in the middle room looked at her from their many quiet hundreds of stations. The way old companions look at one from across a long room. There was, in every shelf, the small, slight room for one more book that any good library always had. She went to the first sconce. She turned the key. The flame lowered. She turned it again. The flame went out. With that small, soft pop she had come to find, over 22 years, one of the small, companionable sounds of her evenings. She moved to the second sconce. She moved to the third. The middle room, with its sconces out, became a long, low cave of stacks, lit now only by the indirect spill from the reference room beyond. The spines of the books along both sides of the central aisle were in the deepest part of the day's dim, and Eliza, who knew them all, could still see them. Knew them not by sight at this moment, but by long association. The way a woman who has lived in a house knows where each thing is in the dark. She stood for a moment in the middle of the middle room. She let her eyes go down the long shelves. She thought of nothing in particular. She thought, perhaps, of the small fact that she had stood in this same place at this same hour, on perhaps 6,000 evenings. There was not in this fact anything sad. The shelves were good shelves. The books were good books. The dim was a good dim. The dim of a library closed for the night and held by one woman who knew it. She moved into the reference room. The reference room was the smallest of the 3 public rooms, and its 2 sconces were set in the wall opposite the iron stove. She did not turn them out yet. She would turn them down when she had finished her round of straightening, when she had made her last entry in the daybook, when she had read her small few pages of Tennyson in the armchair by the stove. The reference room she always closed last. The reference room she always kept lit a little longer, because it was, in the evening, her favorite room. She walked back, slowly through the middle room. She straightened as she went. 1 or 2 books on the shelves she passed. She did this every night. She did it not because the books were ever badly out of place, but because the small attention of pushing a book in by 1/4 of an inch, of evening up the line of spines on a shelf, was a small attention that the books seemed to ask of her, and that she had long since given them. She straightened in the New England Writers section near the far wall. A small green cloth-bound volume of Hawthorne, which had slumped a little against the next. The library's copy of Hawthorne's Mosses from an Old Manse had a small water stain on the back cover, from some old reader's umbrella long before her time, that she had always liked. She drew it out an inch or 2, looked at it and slid it back. The book made a small, clean, dry sound as it went back into its place. The small, careful sound of a book sliding back into the long row of its companions. A sound she could have picked out, blindfolded from any of the sounds a library makes. She moved on. A few feet further along in the Hudson Valley histories, she stopped in front of a tall row of bound volumes about the early Dutch settlements along the river. She had read most of them many years ago, in a long winter when she had been laid up with a slight cold, and the books had a particular small association in her mind with that winter, with the long evenings of reading by the iron stove, with the soft fall of snow on the roof. She did not draw any out tonight. She simply touched with 2 fingers the spine of one of them, a small dark blue volume on the Beekman family papers, the way a woman touches the lid of a box to make sure it is closed. And she moved on. She came into the reference room. She stopped in front of the glass case along the east wall, where the library kept its small collection of older volumes. She bent slightly to look at a small set of Washington Irving, the Putnam edition from 1855, that had been given to the library many years ago by an old Tarrytown family. The bindings were the color of old burgundy. The spines had small gold lettering that had faded slightly at the tops. She liked them. They were not rare. They were simply familiar. And the man who had written them had walked the same streets, had known the same river bend, had seen with his own eyes the same low hills and the same long meadows that lay outside the windows of the library now. A few inches to the right of the Irving, behind the same glass, was a slim brown leather volume of Tennyson that she kept there mostly because she liked having it nearby. It was not the copy she read at night. The copy she read at night sat on the small cherry desk. This copy in the glass was an older copy, the 1870 edition of the Idylls of the King in a fine brown calf binding. She did not open the case tonight. She only looked at the volume through the glass, and she gave it the small private nod a woman gives an old companion at a remove, and she turned away. She completed the round. She went, slow, back to the cherry desk in the reference room. The desk was small and old, and made of cherry. It had a worn green leather inset on its top. Eliza sat at it most evenings when she was not in the armchair. And she did, at the desk, a number of small things. The small bookkeeping of the library, the writing of letters to dealers in New York and Boston, the cataloging of new arrivals, the careful, patient correspondence of a small village librarian's life. Tonight she had only the daybook to attend to. The daybook was a tall green ledger, bound in cloth, with the small gold legend, Sleepy Hollow Public Library, pressed into the cover. It sat on the desk to the right of the brass and green lamp. She opened it to the page she had been keeping all month. She took up the pen. She dipped it in the small ink well that lived in a brass collar at the upper right of the desk. She wrote. She wrote the date, December the 16th, 1898. She wrote the time of closing, 8 o'clock. She wrote the names of the patrons who had come and the books they had borrowed. The young woman with the carols, the boy with the slate, Mrs. Vanderveer with her novel, Mr. Pell with his second volume. She wrote a small note about the weather, that snow had been falling since 11 and was expected to continue through the night. She wrote, beside the day's small total of borrowings, the small initials EHC in the steady small hand she had been writing in the daybook since the spring of '76. She set the pen down. She looked at the page for a moment. She had a small, fine hand, a fine and careful hand, the kind of hand a woman develops who has filled out many tens of thousands of small, precise lines over a long working life. She thought briefly of the librarians who had filled this same ledger before her. Mrs. Ackerman, and before her, a Mrs. Schuyler whose hand had been a more sloping hand than hers. The daybook was a small, slow river. She was only the most recent stretch of it. She closed the daybook. She set it at the back of the desk. She went to the iron stove. The stove was a small black cast iron stove in the corner of the reference room. An old Glenwood that had been put in when the library was first opened, and that had been serviced every September for as long as she could remember, by a man named Mr. Becker, who came up from White Plains with his tools. The stove was, in winter, the heart of the library. It heated the reference room first, and then, through the open doorway, sent its warmth slowly back through the middle room and the front room, until by mid-morning of any winter day, the whole building was held at the small, even temperature of late autumn, the temperature at which books like to be kept. She opened the small grate. There were already a few embers from earlier in the afternoon. She fed them. A small piece of birch first, then a split of pine. The fire took in its small, careful way. She closed the grate. She stood for a moment with her hands held just above the iron top of the stove, feeling the warmth begin to rise. And then she turned to the armchair beside it. The armchair was a deep old chair in faded green velvet, with a small round antimacassar on its high back that she had crocheted herself many years ago. The chair had been bought for the reference room in '81, It had received Eliza nearly every evening since. She sat. The chair greeted her, the way old chairs greet old sitters. It had a small, low creak as she settled into it that she had heard so many evenings. She no longer really heard. The small, green-shaded reading lamp on the desk had not been turned off, and its light fell warm and yellow across the arm of the chair, across her knee, across the small leather volume that she had set an hour ago, on the round side table beside it. The volume was a small old copy of Tennyson, the brown cloth-bound Crowell edition from '75, that she had been reading off and on for many years. It was not new to her. She had read it many times. She read it slowly, a few pages a night, and she had, in the way of long, slow readers, fallen into a habit of opening it at random rather than reading it through. It was a book that took to that habit. It was a book that gave the reader, on almost any page, something to take to bed. She opened it. The page she had marked with a thin slip of paper was the page on which the poem "Crossing the Bar" began. She had marked it the night before. She had read it then. She read it again tonight. The poem was short. The poem was so short that reading it, she heard it as much from memory as from the page. The way a person hears a hymn she has known since childhood. She read, "Sunset and evening star, and one clear call for me. And may there be no moaning of the bar when I put out to sea." She paused. The lamp made its small, soft circle around the chair. The stove in the corner gave a small, soft creak of its iron as it warmed. The snow against the rear window of the reference room, which looked out onto a small yard behind the building, where in summer she kept 3 rose bushes and a small wooden bench, was a soft, even pressing of white against the dark glass. She read on. But such a tide as moving seems asleep, too full for sound and foam, when that which drew from out the boundless deep turns again home. She let the words settle in her, the small, slow way they always settled, and she turned the page, and she read the next stanza, and the next, and then she came to the end of the poem, and she closed her eyes for a small moment in the green-lit warmth of the chair, and let it pass through her. She had read this poem perhaps 1,000 times. The Tennyson had been one of the first volumes she had brought with her when she had taken the position 22 years ago. A gift from her father, who had himself been a quiet reader and who had died in '84. The book was as old as her work in the library. The Tennyson was, in her life, less a volume and more a kind of slow river that ran along the edge of her working evenings. She turned the pages. She read, after the crossing the bar, a few stanzas of The Lady of Shalott. The poem was longer and she did not read the whole of it. She read only the first part. The part about the 4 gray walls and the 4 gray towers, and the silent aisle, and the willows whitening, the aspens quivering, the little breezes dusk and shiver through the wave that runs forever by the island in the river. She read it slow. The cadence of it was a cadence she knew well. She paused after the first part, with her finger marking the place. She thought in a slow way that was not really thinking of the long winter when she had been 16, and her mother had given her her first copy of Tennyson, of the small farm parlor in Yonkers, in which she had read it for the first time, of the way her mother had looked at her across the parlor and had said nothing, only had smiled, the way mothers smile at daughters they have known would be readers. Her mother had been gone almost 30 years now. The Tennyson she had given Eliza was the Tennyson on the desk in the reference room downstairs. She read on a little further. She read the way she had read all her life, with a slight inward lean, her eyes moving slowly down the page, her lips not moving but somewhere just inside her mouth, holding the small shapes of the words. She paused at lines she liked. She underlined nothing. She read. After a time, she closed the book and set it on the round table beside the chair. She sat for a moment without moving. The book had been a friend tonight. The chair was a friend. The stove was a friend. The snow against the dark window, the snow pressing its small white silence against the glass, was a friend. She stood up. Her knees did the small popping thing they did these days. She smiled a little in the lamplight. She was 55. She had been 55 for some months. She did not mind. She crossed the reference room slow. and she turned down the 2 wall sconces. She turned the keys. The flames lowered. She turned them again. The flames went out with their small, soft pops, and the reference room sank into the smaller light of the green-shaded desk lamp alone. She walked to the lamp. She turned it down to its lowest. The stove gave its low, warm glow through the isinglass window and its iron door. And the room, lit by these 2 small, low lights, became a small, held cave at the back of the library. The way it became every evening at this hour. She walked, slow, to the small back office. She set her cup, which she had carried in earlier, and set on the cherry desk during her reading in the small porcelain sink. She would wash it in the morning. She turned on the small kerosene plate, lit it with a long match from the brass tin on the counter, and set the kettle on. The kettle was a small brass kettle with a wooden handle that her mother had carried with her when she had come over from England as a young woman in the 40s, and that had passed to Eliza after her mother's death in 70. The wooden handle had been replaced once, 10 years ago, by the same Mr. Becker who came every September for the stove, who had carved her a new handle out of cherry wood. She stood at the small counter for a moment, looking at the kettle, listening to the snow. The kettle began, after a little time, to make its first small ticking sounds. She took down from the small open cabinet above the counter a fresh cup, a white china cup with small painted forget-me-nots around the rim that her sister Margaret had sent her from Albany the Christmas before. She took a measure of strong black tea from the small tin caddy beside the kettle and put it in the small china pot. She set the cup and the pot beside the kettle. She waited. She was not in a hurry. The snow against the small office window made its long, even, soft sound. A small bare branch of the elm tree that grew at the back of the small yard tapped very gently against the upper part of the window in a small wen from the river. She had grown fond of the small tapping sound. The tree had been there longer than she had been there. The tapping had become, over years, the small voice of the back of the building. The kettle came to its boil. She poured. She watched the steam rise off the pot. She let the tea steep for the long minutes she always let it steep. She poured a cup. She set the cup down. She turned the kerosene plate off. She carried the cup slowly through the small office door, across the reference room, and to the door at the foot of the stairs to her apartment. She opened the door. The stairwell was narrow and the wood was old, and made the small particular sounds it always made when she climbed. The third step from the bottom always creaked. The seventh always creaked. The 10th gave a smaller, higher creak, almost a chirp. The 14th, near the top, made no sound at all. She climbed slowly the way she climbed everything now. The teacup was warm in her hand. She held it carefully as one holds a candle in a long hallway. The apartment at the top of the stairs was small. It had a sitting room with one large window facing Beekman Avenue, a small bedroom, a smaller kitchenette, and a tiny washroom. The sitting room had a small horsehair sofa and an old wing-backed armchair in faded blue brocade, and a small bookshelf along one wall, and a side table beside the armchair, and a kerosene lamp on a small brass stand. The walls had 3 framed prints on them, all of English landscapes. There was a small upright piano against the wall opposite the window, which her aunt had left her in '72, and on which she occasionally played the small hymns and parlor songs she had learned as a child. She did not play tonight. She set the cup on the side table beside the armchair. She turned on the kerosene lamp. The room came up in its soft yellow light. She went slow to the small bedroom and changed out of her gray wool dress into the long, soft flannel wrapper she wore in the evenings. The one with the small frayed cuff at the right wrist that she had told herself for a year she would mend, and had not. She took off her shoe. She put on the wool slippers that had been a Christmas gift from her sister Margaret in Albany 4 winters ago, and that had, in those 4 winters, become her favorite indoor thing. She came back to the sitting room. She sat down in the armchair. The chair greeted her, the way old chairs greet old sitters. It had a small low creak as she settled into it that she had heard so many evenings she no longer really heard. She picked up the cup. She drank. The window beside the chair looked out onto Beekman Avenue, which ran down toward the village center. And beyond that, toward the long sweep of the Hudson half a mile away. She could not see the river. She had never been able to see the river from this window, but she could see the street, and she could see at this hour 3 gaslights along the avenue, each of them in its small yellow circle in the falling snow. And she could see the slow, soft falling of the snow itself. A million small motes drifting through each yellow circle. And she could see the dark, even cover of new snow on the boards of the sidewalk, and on the long picket fences of the small wooden houses across the street. She sat. She drank. The cup was warm in her hands and warm in her chest. The wrapper was warm. The slippers were warm. The room was warm in the way that a small, low-ceilinged room above a heated library is warm in December. Not very warm, but warmly enough. The stove downstairs, banked low for the night, was sending its slow, gentle warmth up through the floorboards. She could feel it if she let her bare ankles rest, as she did, against the small brass register set into the floor by the chair. She let her head settle back against the high old upholstery of the chair. She thought for a small, slow while of nothing in particular. She thought, perhaps, of the small, ordinary fact that she had been doing this exact thing, in this exact chair, on perhaps 3,000 snowy December evenings. There was not in this fact anything sad. The chair was a good chair. The tea was good tea. The snow against the glass was a good snow. She had become, over time, a connoisseur of her own small evenings. And the connoisseurship had a quality she could not have named when she was younger, but that she knew well now. She thought briefly of her sister Margaret in Albany, who would, when she next wrote, ask her again to come for Christmas. She would, when she next wrote her back, say that she could not leave the library through the winter. They had had this same exchange in writing for many years. Margaret would understand. She always did. She drank. She watched the snow. The snow had a quality, falling through the gaslight, of being almost still, of being suspended in the yellow circles below the lamps for a long, slow moment before resuming its small downward drift. She had always loved that. She had always loved the way snow looked under gaslight, the way each individual flake became, for 1/2 second, a small bright thing as it passed through the yellow column, and then was gone. And then another flake came, and another. The gaslight had been put in along Beekman Avenue only 11 years ago. And before that, the avenue had been dark at this hour. And the snow had fallen those nights too, into a darkness. And only the few small lights of windows had shown it falling. The light had changed how the snow looked. The snow had not changed. A small horse-drawn sleigh went down the street. Slow. She watched it pass. The sleigh was a small open cutter with one horse and a single driver bundled in a long dark coat. There was the small soft tinkling of harness bells, very faint through the closed window, and the small muffled clip of the horse's hooves on the packed snow. And then the sleigh had passed the third gaslight and was gone into the dim of the next block. And she could hear, for a moment longer, the bells. And then the bells too were gone, and the avenue was quiet again. She sat. She drank. She thought of nothing in particular. She thought of the small old volume of Tennyson on the desk downstairs, and of the page she had marked with the slip of paper. She thought of the daybook on its corner of the desk, and of the small line of EHC at the bottom of its last entry. She thought of the stove banked low for the night in the reference room, the small steady warmth coming up through the floor. She thought of the long oak stacks below her, and of the books on them, and of the small, clean, dry sound a book makes when it slides back into its place. She thought of Mr. Pell going home in the snow, his new volume tucked inside his coat. She thought of the young woman with the Christmas carols, who would on Sunday sing them with the children at the Reformed church. She thought of the boy with the slate, in his own bed by now in some small house off Sunnyside Lane. She thought of Mrs. Vanderveer with her new novel, sitting by her own lamp in the white farmhouse out by the bend in the Pocantico. She thought of the snow on the long meadows down toward the Hudson, and of the snow on the low hills behind the cemetery, and of the snow on the slates above her own apartment, and of the way the whole town, in this hour, was being covered, slow and soft, by the long, quiet falling. She finished her tea. She set the cup on the side table. She sat for a long while longer with the cup empty. The snow went on. The street went on. The small yellow circles of the gaslights went on. Somewhere in the distance, very faint, a church bell rang the half hour, and she counted. Slow. 8.5. And she nodded to herself, and she went on, sitting. After a time, she reached up and turned the kerosene lamp down a little, so that the light became smaller and closer. The sitting room sank into a softer dim. The only light in the room now was the lamp on the side table, and beyond the window the slow falling snow under its small far gaslights. She sat in this softer light for some long while more. She let her eyes close just for a moment. She thought in a slow way that was not really thinking. Of all the libraries she had ever known, she had been a small library reader in Yonkers as a child. She had been an assistant clerk in a small academy library in White Plains for 3 years in her late 20s, before she had come up to Tarrytown. She had been the head librarian in Sleepy Hollow now for 22 years. The keeping of books had been her work in one form or another since she was 12 years old. She was 55 now. She was not old, but she was no longer young, and she was settled into the work in the way a hand settles into an old glove. She folded both her hands in her lap. She sat. She watched the snow. Then she stood up. She turned off the kerosene lamp in the sitting room. The room sank into the soft dim it sank into, lit only by the small thread of gaslight coming in through the window from the far lamps on the avenue. And on the wall behind her, the slow pale slip of a shadow as a small branch outside the window moved very slightly in the snow. She went, slow, to the bedroom. The bedroom was a small, low-ceilinged room with one window facing the small yard behind the building. An iron bedstead with a wool blanket folded twice at the foot. A small chest of drawers against the wall. A chair by the window and a small kerosene lamp on the bedside table. That was all. She had never needed more. She lit the lamp. She turned the wick low. She went to the small washstand in the corner and washed her face and hands in the small white basin, in the slow, steady way she had washed them every night of her adult life. The water in the pitcher was cold. she did not mind. She had warmed it once or twice in younger years, and had found that the warming had not improved the washing, and had given up on it. She dried her face on the small linen towel beside the basin. She brushed her hair, slow, the way she had brushed it every night for 40 years. 50 long strokes counted to herself, the way her mother had taught her in the small farm parlor in Yonkers. She set the brush down. She came back to the bedside. She sat on the edge of the bed. The bed had been her bed for 22 years. It was an old iron bedstead with a good firm wool mattress and a wool blanket folded twice at the foot. It greeted her the way old beds greet old sleepers, with a small, soft, yielding sound, and the memory of her shape. She slipped out of the wrapper. She folded it across the chair by the window. She kept her long flannel nightgown, which she had put on under the wrapper earlier. She kept the wool socks she wore in winter. She slid into the bed. The blanket was wool and heavy and smelled very faintly of cedar from the chest, where she kept it through the summer. She pulled it up. She lay back. She folded one arm behind her head. She let the other rest on her chest, where she could feel the slow rise and fall of her own breath. She reached then, with one slow hand, for the small leather-bound notebook that she kept on the bedside table, and for the pen. She opened the notebook to a fresh line. She wrote in the same fine, careful hand. She wrote in the daybook downstairs. December the 16th, 1898. Snow all afternoon. Mr. Pell came for the second volume. The Bramley and Stainer went home with a young woman for the Sunday school. The stove banked well. Tennyson tonight. Crossing the bar and the first part of The Lady of Shalott. The branch tapping the office window. She closed the notebook. She set it back. She turned the small lamp on the bedside table low. The room sank further. Only a small last orange thread of flame remained in the wick. She closed her eyes. The snow against the small bedroom window made its long, even, soft sound. The soft pressing of snow against glass, which is almost no sound at all, but is the small softening of the air around any house in a deep snowfall. Far down the avenue, very faint through the closed window, the church bell rang the hour. She counted in her half-sleep. 9, She had not realized how long she had sat in the sitting room. It did not matter. The library below her, dark now, with its long rows of stacks and its many quiet thousands of books and its small green-shaded lamp turned low, and its old iron stove banked for the night, kept itself. She thought slowly of small things. She thought of Mr. Pell, going home now through the snow with his new volume, walking up the long road toward Beekman Hollow, perhaps stamping his boots on his own porch, perhaps opening his own door into the warm yellow of his own kitchen. She thought of his sister coming up from the city for Christmas, who would perhaps come into the library on a snowy morning before the holiday, and would stand for a moment in the front room and look at the long oak stacks, and would say very quietly that the library was a lovely small place. She thought of the small water stain on the back of her hawthorn. She thought of the cup in the sink in the small office. She thought of the small branch tapping the office window. She thought of Alfred Tennyson, who had died only 6 years ago, and whom she had read since she was a girl, and whose long evening voice had become, in her life, one of the small, steady voices of her work. She thought of the line about the tide that, moving, seems asleep. She thought of the small, clear call of the evening star. She thought of the lamplighter who came up Beekman Avenue every evening with his long brass pole. She did not know his name. She had seen him for years. She thought that she would, one of these days, learn his name. She thought of the boy with the slate. She thought of Mrs. Ackerman, who had taught her the order of the closing in '86, and who had been gone these 12 years to Trenton, and whom she had not seen since, but whose hand she still recognized in the older entries of the daybook. She thought of her mother in the small farm parlor in Yonkers, smiling without speaking. Her thoughts slowed. They became no longer thoughts, but only the gentle drift of one thing into another. The snow, the blanket, the slow rise and fall of her breath, the small, slow tick of the wooden clock on the wall of the library below her, which she could not hear from her bed, but which she knew was there, and which had been there since before her. She let it pass over her. She let it pass over her again. The snow went on, and the library went on below her. and the long Hudson Valley December settled in around the building, and Eliza, who was tired and warm and not afraid, drifted gently down into the deep, easy quiet of sleep. The snow kept falling. The gaslights along Beekman Avenue kept their small yellow circle. The library kept itself. And somewhere in the long quiet of the building, in the reference room, the small iron stove that she had banked before going up sent up one last small, gentle pulse of warmth into the dark stacks of her books. And the books, on their old oak shelves, settled into themselves for the night. The clock on the wall above the front counter ticked. The clock in the reference room ticked. The two clocks were not quite in step, and over the long course of the night they would drift in and out of each other's rhythm in the way they always did. Two slow, patient voices speaking past each other in the dark, and the snow against the roof of the library would go on, and the small, soft branch against the office window would go on its small, soft tap. And Eliza, asleep in her bed above them all, would not hear any of it, and would not need to hear any of it, because the building was holding her, and the snow was holding the building, and the night was holding the snow, and she was a small-held thing inside a long-held thing inside a longer-held thing still. She slept. She dreamt briefly of a small river running by an island, of 4 gray towers in the willows, of a quiet voice somewhere just out of sight calling that the tide was full and the moaning of the bar was stilled. She turned in her sleep once, very slightly to the left. She settled. She slept on, far away beyond the village, beyond the meadows, beyond the long slope of Cantico, bending down toward the great wide Hudson. The snow was falling on the river itself, and on the dark wooded hills above it, and on the long, quiet stretch of the valley that ran north toward Sing Sing and south toward the city. And the snow was falling also on the small, low slate roof of the old Beekman house, under which Eliza slept, and on the long oak stacks beneath that roof, and on the small slip of paper that marked her place in the Tennyson on the cherry desk. The snow kept falling. The night kept being the night. And that was all. And now, a few quiet words to carry into sleep. You are safe. You are warm. day is done. Nothing more is asked of you tonight. The room around you holds you gently. The bed beneath you holds you fully. Your body knows how to rest. Your mind may let go now. The long quiet is here. Sleep well, my friend. From the long quiet, sleep well, my friend. From the long quiet.